Now, let's play around a little bit about that simple concept. What happened if the government increased the spending? And I thought this is a good example because it's so fitting with the Indonesian situation right now. Because I understand now Indonesian government wants to spend a lot, for infrastructure and so forth. So that means the G, capital G here, capital G will have to go up here. So if the equilibrium of GDP Indonesia is Y here, right here, okay, at point A, and let's assume we are in a trade balance here. So to be fair, we have to start from balance. What happened if the government's spending increase? Well, let's look what happened. Boom, increase, point A moves to point A prime. Okay, output increase from Y to Y prime, but trade deficit widened. So this is exactly what happened with the Indonesian economy now. We are trapped now because every time we want to increase our GDP above 5%, let's say we want to increase our GDP to 7%, then we have to suffer from widening trade deficit. Okay. Yes, please.
Prof. Just a quick clarification. So what does the curve with the 45-degree angle represent?
Oh, that is only indicating the balance between output and demand. You see the y-axis is demand, the x-axis is output. Okay? Remember the concept of multiplier? Suppose there is no multiplier, then everything will be following the 45-degree line. So whatever amount of demand you put, let's say 100, output will also increase by 100. But that is not multiplier. That is the case of non-multiplier. But in macroeconomics, there is a concept of multiplier.
Okay. So because we take into account the multiplier effect, that's why there's a
yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, correct. Okay, so this is clear, right? So if we are originally in a balanced position, the moment government increase their spending, let's say for infrastructure, our deficit will widen. Okay. Now, by the way, when you increase the government spending, G, there is another deficit that you suffer, and that is called the fiscal deficit. Because when the government spending, assuming tax does not go up, definitely the fiscal deficit will go up. So now you have two deficits, fiscal deficit and trade deficit. And that's why it's called the twin deficit. Okay? And at this moment, Indonesia suffers from that. That's why this chart, even though it's very simple, it's a good representation of what happened with the Indonesian economy now. Alright, so this is the summary. When the government wants to expand the fiscal sector for whatever reason, this for infrastructure, for building here, building there, or whatever, that will lead to fiscal deficit. Okay. Now, but building infrastructure will generate output increase, so that's why the growth is higher. But at the same time, that will lead also to widening trade deficit. So at the end, you have two deficits, trade deficit and fiscal deficit, and that leads to twin deficit. Okay. Now, if we use this simple, yes, please.
Question. I'm sorry, I would like to go back a little bit. I still don't get the sense of how higher growth in GDP result in more trade deficit. So,
well, can you see this? Or you can even go back to here, before the chart before here. How do I move this? Why didn't? Okay, here. See, that's the case. So suppose you start from the equilibrium here, output, and you want to increase the GDP to the right? Boom! Look what happened. The deficit widened. Is that clear? This I will they start from originally already having small trade deficit. Okay? The moment you increase output, your trade deficit widen. But the same story, you can start from the equilibrium. So suppose the initial point is no deficit. Look at this. There's no deficit. This is balance, right? Starting point. But the same story, when you increase the output, boom, the trade deficit widens. So that is the theoretical explanation. If your question is more like the story of real world situation, I was telling you earlier, because if Indonesia wants to increase output, we need to produce, right? But we cannot produce if we don't import. Because Indonesian economy are so dependent on import. We cannot produce our own intermediate inputs or raw materials. So that's why we need to have a lot of import. Now, this is too early for you to understand, but later on, I don't know, maybe in macro 2, there's a concept which is called the elasticity of substitution. In Indonesia, I calculated the elasticity of substitution is very low. Meaning what? Meaning every time we want to increase our output, we need to increase our import. So that's basically the story of elasticity of substitution. But let's not talk about it for this class, because that's a bit mathematical. Okay? Is that clear? All right. So let's continue here. So I was saying earlier, all the story that we just learned basically can be put in equation which is straightforward here. What you do is just, moving around variables from the right to the left and so on. And at the end, what you have is this. Aha! So you have fiscal deficit because T minus G less than 0, that means fiscal deficit because T is tax, G is government. So if it is minus 0, that means the spending is more than the tax, right? That's why it's fiscal deficit. And that happens along with, so together with, export minus import negative, which is trade deficit. And that is what is called the trade deficit. And as I said earlier, this reflects exactly what happened with the Indonesian economy now. And this is the chart, if you want to see. By the way, this is in value. So the top one is trade balance, that's in US dollar, in billion US dollar. And then the bottom one is our fiscal balance, APBN. In bahasa Indonesia is APBN. That's basically the fiscal balance, but in rupiah. So of course you cannot compare because one is in dollar, the other is in rupiah. So instead of using this, why don't we use the share GDP? Because usually this is what is used by macroeconomics. So here is the chart. Okay. So if you look at the trade balance, for example, we are now in the red. In the red means deficit, right? The latest one, the deficit started in 2018, so 2 years ago, and last year is still deficit. So the red one is the trade deficit. Now the dark one, the dark black, that's the fiscal sector. It's also deficit, below 0, right? So clearly Indonesia suffered from twin deficit. Okay? Now there is another curve there, which is the dotted curve. The concept of trade deficit is actually only one side of the balance of payment. Now that reminds me, I want to check with Jana and Fauzi, because we supposed to also train students to read different accounts in macroeconomics, like national income account, fiscal account, and the balance of payment account. Okay, and once you understand what those accounts, and today I'm talking about balance of payment account, once you understand that, then you see the difference between trade balance and current account balance. Okay, so that dotted line is current account balance. Okay, so the red one is trade balance, the dotted lines are current account balance. Both of them are within one account, which is called the balance of payment. But I'm sure Jose and Jana will, I don't know when, is going to explain to you so that you understand why there are two balance of payment account there. One is trade balance and the other is current account balance. What is the difference and so on? That should be explained in the, I don't know, lab or extra session. But coming back to the twin deficit, you notice that in the case of fiscal balance, we have been always in deficit since 2011. Can you see that? The dotted line? I'm sorry, not the dotted line, the dark line, the dark black line. I was wrong, since 2009 actually. So in 2009, but before 2008, we were always in deficit too. But the biggest deficit measured by ratio to the GDP, I would say in 2015, right? That's the biggest one. Now remember, this fiscal deficit is measured as a ratio to GDP. And the reason why we measure that, because then we can put together in one chart along with the trade deficit, because the trade deficit is also measured as a ratio to GDP. But if you look at the amount, the rupiah value, our fiscal deficit is really, really bad. Look at this. Look at the fiscal deficit on the bottom one. Going very sharply, okay, on the negative territory. Okay?